Welcome back to the second session of Rod's workshop, Events in 2020 and their impact on the police-public relationship. Just a short reminder that we'll be continuing the same format as yesterday, so please pop your chats, your comments, your thoughts and your questions in the chat box on the right, and then we can reflect those back and Rod can answer those as he goes along through his presentation. A special welcome this morning to our colleagues and friends dialing in from abroad. Thank you very much. It's lovely to have you. Great. Thank you very much, Rod. Over to you.
So good morning. Thank you very much. Let's see if today I can share my screen more effectively than I did yesterday. And I'm hoping that you can now see the presentation, which is a much better start than yesterday morning. So it's really great to have so many of you join us again today. And today I wanted to move a little bit of the debate on to consider the impact upon police officers and the police, their actions, and a sort of strategic response to what we saw or what we discussed yesterday. And I think from my perspective, there is so much involved in this that we could talk about it forever, or I could talk about it forever. So I'm going to try and contain myself quite considerably. Yesterday, I'll just quickly recap on what we did. We talked a little bit about the policing model in the UK, history of policing, what is seen as important. Talked about history and immediacy, the sorts of issues that caused us particular problems in the UK and probably across many parts of the world this year, through the impact of the George Floyd murder, killing, and obviously the Black Lives Matter campaign, and also the impact of those demonstrations on policing, the sorts of demonstrations we had to deal with in the UK, how they were managed and what we did. And then a little bit of a sort of, we talked about what's happened as a result of policing, what's happened to policing from a community perspective. And I gave it quite a heavy focus on the particular issues of disproportionality. And that brings me back to the sort of core bit we're talking about, is this: if we're looking at a question of legitimacy and performance, and in legitimacy, we have to mean the whole of society believing the police is legitimate and what they're doing is correct, and performance, the police's ability to do their job. We have to make sure that we're doing those sorts of things for everybody and not just for part of the community. So today I want to have a little bit more of a think about the public and the police being the same thing, and therefore to start with a little bit of a reflection on what has happened to the police from a policing perspective. How have police had to change the way they do business and what's happened to them as a result of it? And then we'll move on to this slightly wider strategic response. Yesterday we had I thought we had some really good discussions started to develop, and I'm hoping today that it is more of a discussion session. The intention is to get you much more involved in the subject than yesterday. So please expect, and don't just sign off because I'm saying this, but please expect to have to participate today and to give me some feedback on various things. So just a sort of overview, I think you could look at the impact on the police in sort of three terms: physical, psychological and social. And physical, thinking about the things like practice equipment, the risks, and some of the criticism that they've been having about how they've responded to those risks and some of the jobs they've had to do. And this has particularly been brought to light in London with the murder of Sergeant Matt Ratana. I talked about it a little bit yesterday, but this was a sergeant in a custody officer who was shot by a prisoner who was handcuffed at the time and supposedly in a safe area, but while he was being searched in a COVID secure environment, shot the officer and killed him, and then shot himself. So the sorts of implications of these impacts on police, I'm sure they're the same across the world. For us, this is an impact upon the policing family, not just serving police officers, but ex-police officers shocked by things like this when they happen. The second bit is the sort of psychological impacts. We talked a bit about terror management theory yesterday, about how people make sense of everything. Well, police officers have to do the same thing, and police officers put themselves by definition into positions of risk and harm, and they have to have a framework to protect themselves. So they have to believe that what is being delivered to them in terms of what the practice is, what the PPE is, how they go about their job, is actually going to keep them safe, and they have to believe that what they're doing is worthwhile. And if there's any question about those things, and I believe there's been quite considerable question about them, it's very complex for the officers to maintain their stability, to maintain their coherence in their role, to carry on with what they're supposed to be doing. So they've had this sort of fundamental issue going on in the background, but they've also had a huge amount of overload and stress, and we'll come back and talk about that a few times. But their role has expanded, and it's all, you know, it always sounds good when police service is given more money to do things, but what that really means is officers have to work longer hours, have to work on their days off, have to do yet further work than they usually do, and they are already stretched. So you've got this impact on their mental health, and you've got the impact upon the levels of stress that they're managing. So big psychological impact. And then there's a social impact. One, they're apart from friends and colleagues. You know, social distancing is applied to police officers, so they are not able to connect in the same way. They've also got to think about their family, and I know several police officers who've got members of their family in high-risk groups and who have made decisions not to meet their family. During the initial lockdown, they've completely isolated themselves from their families in order to keep their family safe. So they have put themselves in a position where they work all day trying to keep people safe, and then they come home and they have to change their behaviour to keep people safe. And we have to remember they're different from the rest of the community. While everyone else, or the majority of people, have been in their homes, have been with their families in their social unit, kept there so that they are safe, they have been the ones who've been, or some of the key workers who've been going out and still going through the deserted streets of our big cities and towns. So this is interesting. So I wanted to look at things from a perspective of four themes. And the first one was really to look at PPE, personal protective equipment, and actually what PPE means. And in policing terms, historically, it's you know, in the UK, it's been about knife-proof vests. It's been about the use of CS spray, and it's been about the sorts of equipment that you might use to restrain people. Suddenly it moved from that to the use of face coverings and hand sanitizer. So seen a massive change in what has been seen as the most important element of their personal protective equipment, and there's been some very mixed messages about it as well. Two things. Firstly, massive issue around supply in the initial stages. There was not enough face coverings for anybody, let alone for police officers, to enable them to carry out their work safely. Hand sanitizer was difficult to come by, so there's all sorts of issues about getting the correct hand sanitizer. And also that led to miscommunication about what was effective and what wasn't, and those sort of complex debates around things. Somehow interacted with the police officers and made their lives slightly harder. And then we have sort of operating practice and policy. So let's see if we've got this slide. I'll go back a couple of slides because this came out of order. This is the a graphic produced by the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing to set out the sorts of things that officers should take into account in terms of their personal use of PPE and in terms of risk assessment. And it's sort of quite interesting, this sort of consideration about inside duties and outside duties and the sort of 5 different levels of PPE that have been made available. What is really, I think, quite difficult about all of this is the fact that it is very difficult for a police officer who's doing an activity, for instance, out on patrol, sees somebody doing something and wants to interact with them, to suddenly change their clothing, to change their thoughts about what they're going to do, and to move into a different way of working. And secondly, when we've got all of this going on, it's very hard for the officers to actually think about their safety with their colleagues. If they're sitting in a car with someone for 8 hours a day and it's a different person each day, adds to a load of complex issues for them to think about how they're going to manage that. I thought also when I looked at this initially, is quite a lot of information to be thinking about and working through, but you know, the underlying principle behind it all was stay more than 2 meters away from everyone, which sort of tends to be very difficult in situations when you're going to search people or when you're going to arrest people. And also there's an issue around having to protect the people you're working with as much as you're protecting yourself. So this requirement to give the person you're going to stop and search a surgical mask to wear while you're stopping and searching them is quite a complex one to think about. So changing some of the sorts of thinking about how we interact with people on a fairly basic level. And in a minute, I'd be quite interested to hear a little bit about the practice. So that might be the policy, but it'd be interesting to hear first off what the practice was from people who may have an insight into the UK, but also it'd be good for us to get a little bit of an understanding of what's happening in other parts of the world. Is it the same sort of considerations? And then there's a whole chunk of stuff around risk, which I think is really important for us to think about. What are the actual levels of risks to officers? You know, the issue here is that we have had a lack of clarity about how dangerous this is, a lack of clarity about the message of how dangerous this disease is. On one level, we're being told it is incredibly dangerous, and on the other level, we're being told actually you can deal with this by just washing your hands and keeping a bit of distance from people. So it's a very complex message to get to people, and in a place where officers are routinely involved in risky situations, where does this sit? Is this as dangerous as people who are violent towards police, or is this less dangerous than that? And then the sort of final sort of bit from here is what is the measure of police performance on this? What is the absence of crime and disorder, the fact that people aren't having parties in the street? I don't know. And in the UK this morning, there's a film of police in Liverpool being surrounded by crowds of dancing, screaming, jubilant young people at 11 o'clock last night in a city with one of the highest levels of coronavirus in the world, where people are under a curfew not to do these things, where they're not allowed to meet in these sort of sizes of groups, and 2 police officers in a car that's you know, basically surrounded and attacked by people. So what are we actually trying to achieve in terms of a measure of performance, and how legitimate is the police role seen? Because I would suggest what we saw last night in Liverpool and in a number of universities recently, has been a belief that the police don't have the right, society doesn't have the right to actually dictate these things. So with all that in mind, I wanted to ask you some questions about what things are like where you are. So I'm just going to come out of this so I can write in here. And what I'd like is that if on the chat, in the chat box, people could give me some ideas of PPE that has been used in their country. It'd be really interesting to hear from other countries than the UK, but even across the UK, what sort of PPE is being employed. I'll give you a little bit of time to think about that. And I'm very happy for people to speak if they don't want to put it in the chat, but really, really good to get some other perspectives rather than just mine on here.
I just share a recent experience of visiting the MPOC PPE hub for the UK policing recently, where you mentioned earlier that actually getting PPE police officers at the start of the pandemic was a nightmare, extremely tricky everywhere, but particularly tricky, I think, outside the NHS. And so the police set up a hub and basically created a sort of, were forced to create an Amazon warehouse style hub and an airbase out in Thames Valley in order to try and coordinate resources for the police nationally. And what struck me visiting it, other than how weird it was that it was police officers actually managing this this site, was that you had events team officers and other kind of people whose normal role would be perhaps in policing sporting events or such like, who's had to retrain really quickly to be able to drive forklift trucks and so forth, just to be able to literally manage this warehouse of PPE. And there's a huge amount of stress there and responsibility in terms of having to completely change your role, your focus to something totally different and absolutely critical. But I might add, it was hugely successful as well. But very interesting to see.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. That's really useful to get those sorts of insights. Oh, sorry, let me change slides. Really useful to get those sorts of insights into the scale of the change of policing. We often forget that the change at the front end, the change of what the officers do is one thing, but actually reshaping all of the supply lines, redefining all the roles of officers to support them is also massively important. So Johnny moved on nicely to the fact that it may be policy to do all these things. So Suntajit talked about the lack of social distancing. I'll drop that bit in.
Can I just bring Rexa Roos, Major General Rexa Roos from Cambodia in here? He's got a point to make. Rexa, do you want to speak?
Can you hear me, please? Okay.
Perfect.
So in relation to the question how Cambodian police kept safe during this kind of pandemic or crisis. So actually we, as the armed forces, including military, gendarmerie, and especially police, which is very close involvement with the public in general or public at large. So we follow the guideline of the Ministry of Health, and as well as the awareness ratings through the Ministry of Education by keeping safe and using all these PPE in particular circumstance, which they must use those equipment. And if not so, they have to follow the 3 principles of the WD, washing the hands, watch their distance, and as well as wearing the face. So this is a general guideline issued by the Ministry of Health and Education that we all have to follow. That's all from Cambodia.
Thank you. That was really useful. Can I just ask a question? Did you find issues around supply of PPE in Cambodia for police, or was it something that historically you'd already dealt with similar issues and so were a bit better prepared for it?
Actually, the government has purchased the sufficient supply of PPE for the police to perform the duty, and as well as some donation of PPE from China, I believe. This is we don't have this lack of this particular issue. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for that. That's really interesting and useful to hear. Hands in the UK, there's a 3-thing: hands, space, and face. Interesting to hear the same things were being talked about on the other side of the world.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ian raised an issue here, which is quite an interesting one, about the consideration over paper face masks versus plastic visors. Has there been anywhere in the world a discussion in policing terms about whether face masks are effective? You know, these plastic screens, effectively, that some people are wearing.
So do you pose this question to Cambodia in particular, or to
general? No, it was a general question, but if you can answer it, it would be really useful, but it was a general question.
In Cambodia contact, we just have the paper face mask, that's all, or clothing. You know, we don't use plastic so far. Lovely, and there's no such, no such requirement. Yeah.
So that that whole issue of what a face mask is, I think we had that in the UK quite considerably for a long time, trying to find ways of dealing with this issue differently. So interesting that Peru similarly mentioned the same sort of issue. So it looks like a sort of fairly wide picture. And this other issue around officers working with different people on different days. So how do you know, there must be some way of trying to reduce the risk if we can get that right. So I think one of the things that came out of that for me, just a little bit of a conversation, and it's quite difficult with these sorts of approaches to lead these conversations, is China actually provided face masks to the UK on a sort of one-to-one, almost like a charitable thing, sort of finding ways of getting face masks to us. They obviously did something in Cambodia, and somehow that isn't that well reflected, that huge support that was given to the rest of the world. Somehow has been lost in the debate around things. So we do need to say to the Chinese police, so thank you for what they did on that, because it looks like they help people in a number of different places. So what I wanted to just sort of pick up on here was a couple of things. One of them was PPE was an issue for policing, and it looks like it was an issue in some other areas in the world. The policy eventually seemed to become quite clear in most places in the UK around this hand, space and face type thing, but that was not where we started. We definitely didn't start with the need for face masks. In fact, it was the complete opposite, a long discussion about whether or not these were in any way effective. In fact, a debate that went on for months as to whether or not they worked, rather than actually getting on with providing them. But while that was happening, the sorts of things Karen was talking about were going on in the background to get us to a position where we could actually provide them. So policy seems to have got there. And then there's quite a lot of discussion here around the practice and not actually being necessarily as well defined as the policy. And some officers, you still see them nowadays involved in quite close contact with people, not wearing face masks, not wearing latex gloves. And in policing in the UK, we've been wearing gloves for searching and things for a long time. That's not new, but this somehow seem to have fallen off the agenda recently. So all of this has created for our officers quite a degree of I don't think anxiety is the right word, but quite a degree of background noise which affects them on a daily basis about their role, especially if they don't feel safe, and especially if they're not quite sure what it is they're supposed to be doing, and if the practice and the policy and the provision of PPE don't mix. And unless we can get that conjoined together, it'd be my argument that we are asking too much of our officers. We are expecting them to manage a very difficult and dangerous situation when they're under stress. And my experience of policing is that it's when officers are under strain and stress that the approach becomes a more robust intervention. We have less time for conversation. People want to deal with things quickly. Things start going wrong and it starts unraveling. So a really serious issue for policing. What I wanted to do was sort of take that and our discussions from yesterday and just go back to the first workshop that some of you remember, some of you will have been involved in which Roger Gom talked about crisis management, major incidents, and how the police responds to these sorts of issues. And in particular, I wanted to sort of think about those impacts we've just talked about upon the events of 2020 and try and define where it sits in that major incident process. So we think about COVID-19, I've just sort of pulled out four impacts on, four issues: the impact on society and the police role, so constraints on the public, change in the police role into enforcing health constraints, the issuing of tickets. Yesterday it was reported that 4 students in Nottinghamshire were all issued with £10,000 on the spot fines for running a party. So university students who are already in a financial position of strain suddenly being given these fixed penalty notices of huge amounts of money, much more than anything that we're used to in terms of penalty awards. We've had this shift in cybercrime, so greater reliance on digital technologies has created huge opportunities for criminals to get more involved with the sorts of things that cause problems. We've had a growth in harmful practices, particularly because of the lack of visibility of people, as people are being removed from the source of societal protection, from the interactions from communities. Those things have given opportunity for more of these sorts of crimes to take place. And we just talked a little bit about some of the personal risks to officers and to them as individuals, and particularly to officers who've got members of their family who are a bit more vulnerable. Now, you probably remember, or those who were involved will remember, or from Roger's presentation, these 4 definitions of incidents. Standard incident, routine emergency, major incident, and crisis. Now, putting these four elements into that model, so the impact on society of the change of the police role, cybercrime, harmful practices, and personal risks, I like to think about whether this is a standard incident. Should police be responding to this as a standard, something that they just get on with and deal with on their own? Is it an emergency? Is it something they've got to deal with really, really quickly, get on top of, and move on to the next thing? Is it a major incident involving implications for lots of organisations, or should the police be thinking about this as a crisis? So we want to do a quick poll just to have a look at where people think we sit on that. So if you could just take a couple of minutes to think about which of the following options best describes the events of 2020 from a policing perspective. So hopefully most of you have chosen now, so we have a look at the results. So it's quite an interesting spread across there. So a significant number of people looking at 71% of people think it was a crisis, and then this chunk between it being a major incident and a routine emergency. So I think that's quite interesting, because I actually think that the police response has been quite confused about this, because we've thought about the policing as part of the response to the overall crisis. But I would suggest, so therefore, the thinking about the policing implications have probably been downplayed to somewhere a bit lower than a crisis. Whereas what I would hope we can see here is that this is not just a crisis, it's probably a wicked crisis that will stay with us for many years in terms of dealing with the issues. I was sort of drawn, when I was going through the preparation for this, to this John F. Kennedy quote around Chinese use 2 brush strokes to write the word crisis. And it'd be really interesting for somebody to say whether or not that is true, whether this does come from these 2 words. But his thoughts were, or his interpretation was, in a crisis you need to be aware of the danger but recognize the opportunity, and that maybe now is the time not just to be thinking about the dangers, but also to be thinking about where this might take us in the future and what the opportunities might be for us to do things differently as a result. I was hoping that we might have somebody online who could actually give us a Chinese perspective on whether or not that is what the Chinese for crisis is. Maybe we'll have to wait until afterwards to find that out from someone. So I know this is the definition that Roger gave of a crisis: an abnormal, unstable situation that threatens an organisation's strategic objectives, reputation, or viability. So from a policing perspective, strategic objectives are definitely changing constantly as a result of this. There are a huge number of reputational issues which are sort of have come into play, both in terms of the ability to respond to the incidents, but also in terms of the underlying issues of disproportionality. We've got these sorts of definitions of problems and wicked problems that Rittel and Webber brought up. And I think this is definitely a wicked problem as well as a crisis. There is no good result for policing, no win situation for policing in this, but there are opportunities that we could probably take. It is very difficult the Assistant Chief Constable, who has national leadership for the police response to the pandemic, was on the news, has been on the news the last 2 days, was actually at Parliament yesterday giving evidence about how confusing it is for the public, and therefore how difficult it is for the police to manage all the various new laws. And there have been a significant number of new laws this year brought in, both primary and secondary legislation, and also the sort of government guidance, what people should be doing that doesn't quite meet the threshold of a crime. And we've also, we know this particular crisis is going to carry on and is dangerous and is unstable. We haven't got a clear pathway for the future. It's impacting on individual groups differently from other groups. There are communities at the moment in the UK who are suffering more than other communities. So we've got this regional disparity, and we have the impact on the whole of society with the lack of income that's going on. So there's sorry, the reason I just stopped us, there's a huge amount of stuff in the chat box, which I'll review in a minute, and then perhaps we can have a bit of discussion around those. But I think what I'd like to do now is just sort of think about, what does all this mean, and what are we going to do in the future? So key questions Roger suggested in a crisis you should be thinking about is what has happened, what is happening now, what is being done about it. And I think those for us are probably more complex in this situation, because things that are happening are in some ways quite abstract. Some of us know people who have died, and some of us know people who have been seriously and are at the moment seriously ill from this disease. Many of us don't. So we are reliant a little bit upon what we're being told about things, and that is dependent upon us trusting and having confidence in the messages that are being given to us. So in the UK, there has been a huge reliance on scientific advice and scientific advisors in order to make sure that the political message, the whole debate around what's happening is based in something that people can have trust with. But we haven't been following the guidance as fully as we might have been, and as that starts to unravel, the whole issue around the message becomes more complex. And we haven't really understood, or the public hasn't really been shown, some of the issues around PPE, the issues for the police on a daily basis, what it means to be in any of the frontline services dealing with this. It's being presented through individual stories of people who have been impacted, but it's not being talked about in the way of the whole organisations are having to reshape themselves and refocus on what's happening. So this is not really in the public domain, and to some degree it's not in the policing domain, because the police are too busy doing what's happening at the moment to think about this. So that leads us to the so what bit. So what are the implications about this, and what are the wider impacts? And if we're thinking about this from a strategic response perspective, those are the things we need to do. So what we'd like to do now is just have a very short break, have a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, I want us to look at applying the strategic tool of crisis management that Roger gave us, looking at situation, direction, and action, to what we're dealing with at the moment, to see what we might be able to suggest as good ways forward. So if we could just do a 5-minute break, get yourself away from the screens. I'm trying to balance this morning into slightly smaller chunks so that you're not spending too long sitting in front of a screen. 5 minutes time, we'll come back and we'll actually look at applying that strategic tool to here. So Karen and Daisy, if you could run a timer just so people can see where they are, that would be really useful. And if not, we'll see you back at 9:45.
Thank you. Right, thank you everybody. Welcome back, Rod.
Lovely, thank you, Karen. And just before we move on, I sort of had a chance to reflect on some of these entries in the chat room, and one that you just can't gloss over is Javier's comment around the number of police officers who have died in Peru. And you know, I think to start with, my heart goes out to all of those officers, families, and all the people in Peru who are trying to manage with this absolutely horrendous situation. But also just trying to think about the implications that might have on a police service. How can a police service carry on working with that level of risk, and what sorts of people become police officers who are willing to do a job in these situations? So wanted to make that comment about starting, but you know, I think there were a number of issues in here raised around the clarity of the message from senior leaders, the engagement of people in what they're doing, and how important that is to keep people running. And I know Sundajet had a few points on that, and I wonder whether you'd just like to just give us a very brief update on what your thoughts were from your recent experience in London.
Yes, thank you, Rod. One of them was having met some of the officers on borough, was the lack of PPE at the time, and then clear direction from some of the leaders that were there. Some were attending work, some were, I mean, generally a lot of them were working from home, which left the officers feeling less confident in the leadership that's giving them the direction on what they should be doing. And then the task that was expected of the officers was conflicting with what their general duties were at work, and then the expectation from the government in terms of issuing fines, etc., and maintaining social distancing in public places. So there was disparity between the police and the public in their relations as a result of
that. Thank you. I mean, that sort of image is not one that we would expect to be hearing about, or one I would expect to be hearing about from police leaders. Normally you expect them to be out there alongside their officers and supporting them, and that must have quite a serious implication for the frontline officers. So if we've got all of this stuff going on, and we return back to what we did at the beginning of this series of workshops, looking at crisis management and the strategic tool of situation, direction, action, SDA, that was introduced. I think it'd be quite useful just to think about what we would do, what we think the future could be if we were in those positions, so that we can produce something from these discussions which might be useful for police leaders and police organisations. So just to recap on what the model is you think about the situation, establish what is happening and what it means, bearing in mind, I don't know if you remember back, but the whole issue is at different times in a crisis, you often have the wrong amount of information or the wrong information, so it's always changing as things get clearer. Looking at the direction, what you're trying to achieve, strategic aims, the objectives and desired outcomes where we're trying to get to. And of course, the last bit is what actions, what decision you're going to make, what reflection do you get from the outcomes on what you're doing, what are you going to do next, how do you keep momentum and assurance running. So this sort of strategic model provides us a very clear way of thinking about it. And it's sort of based on situational awareness, this concept of perception, what you think is happening, comprehension, understanding what you perceive, and projection, using that to move forward. So I've sort of, I've tried to lead a bit of a conversation here this morning, but lots of things have come out from there about people's perception of what is happening at the moment. And I think we may be understanding some of it, but maybe not all of it at the moment. But it'd be interesting to try and work out the way forward of all those things. So what I would quite like to do is try and get your views on the situation at the moment. If you were analysing the events of 2020, how would you sum those up in a couple of words? What are the key things that are affecting policing across the world that need to be addressed? And if you just drop them into the chat box so that we can sort of share them. If you put them in there, then I'll copy and paste them over onto this slide, and then at the end of the presentation, everybody will be able to get that information. So you can either, if you don't want to write it on there and you want to say it, very happy to have it. So start off with divided communities. So David, can I just ask you about the issue here about resources? What sort of resources are you talking about?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking really when the money runs out, when the government stops, is no longer able to sustain lockdowns and sort of bumping up the local economies. What I think will happen is that people will start to look for alternative resources. They'll start to steal, they'll start to break into people's houses, and they'll start to survive. That's the worst case scenario.
Thank you. So, that really interesting message. I don't know what it's like in the rest of the world, but in the UK, the amount of money that is being spent on supporting activity is eye-watering. In a country that's lived through austerity for the last 10 years, where we haven't had money to pay for pencils in schools at times, it seemed like. I mean, that's me exaggerating quite considerably. But suddenly we can find trillions of pounds to keep some semblance of normality running, and that won't always follow on. And then quite Ian's comment there about the north and south in the UK, this tension that suddenly started erupting last week, that political leaders talking about the fact that part of the UK is being looked after better than others. And Abigail, really important point, I think, is this issue about inequality. Some people staying at home is a good thing. It's not necessarily a good thing for everybody. And for some people, they can stay at home in relative safety, others can't. Some people have to be on the front line. So this whole, we're starting to split society into different lumps of people with different types of risks, with different responsibilities. And one of the things that I would sort of put in there is the people who are defined as frontline are probably the lower paid people in society. And the people who are least affected by it are probably the better paid people in society. So a whole number of things are causing, coming together that could cause real issues. And I just sort of fancy that again talk about this whole financial crisis. What is coming next? Sorry, I just copied the wrong thing. Let's do it again. But what's coming next in terms of issues and risk? So what I'd like to move on to now is to think about direction. What do we think we should be doing in terms of the direction? I want this specifically to be from a policing perspective. We're not trying to resolve the issue of COVID-19. We're not trying to resolve there, but what do we think, where do we think the police should be positioning ourselves? Should we be thinking about policing in terms of generic law enforcement? Should we be thinking about how we enforce the different laws? Is it appropriate for us to be issuing fixed penalty? Actually, I don't even know if it was the police who issued, but you know, the fixed penalty notice for large amounts of money to situations. So what do we think the direction is? So there's a possibility of us moving towards martial law in the UK, which is just bizarre. Who would have thought a year ago we'd have been talking about things like this? So issue there about how, a direction of empowering the community to do things, trying to think about how people could make this a less negative thing and a more positive thing. So where we have Neighbourhood Watch, which for people from outside the UK, just to reiterate, is a community-led approach where people look out for each other, if you like, and when there is an issue, report it to the police or try and resolve it. It's a crime prevention advice generically, but could we use it here? Yeah, really interesting one about study seriously, looking at the budget in more detail. Interesting suggestion here about thinking about differential roles and maybe PCSOs, police community support officers, taking up the COVID roles and police taking up the other roles, which is probably okay, I would suggest, while we have reasonable support for the rules. If the support for the rules drops and enforcement becomes more of an issue, may not be quite so doable. And Ian raised the issue about how many PCSOs have we got left in the UK, because they've been massively cut through the issues of austerity. And then perhaps the thought about the use of the military. So these are quite big steps about where we might go in the future. And I suppose some of the thoughts that were going through my head as well were things like, at the moment, have we really learned the lesson around PPE? And have we got a plan for the future around other risks? Have we thought enough about national resilience? And we've talked here about a health issue, changing the way the police working, changing away to potential martial law into possibly bringing the military in, and that's happened in 8 months. So all of these sorts of changes are happening remarkably quickly. And are we ready for what might happen next? Because if we look at the National Resilience Plan for the UK, and I know the World Health Organization has also published an international report on this, that across the world, the police were not involved in the pandemics other than supporting the health, rather than thinking about these security implications that are likely to fall out of them. So I'll just put that down as PPE and international for my one in there. So we sort of started to move into what we might do about it, actions, and those sort of raised the issue here of is the issue of international cooperation. What other views do people think about what the police should be doing? Not what the general direction is, but what do we think we should be doing to make it better? So yeah, so there's clear lines of communication, public consultation. I think one of the things that I've seen, which I think is a real issue, is that we've been telling the public things rather than engaging the public in solutions. So there's, because of the need to do things quickly, we've stopped all of the normal debates with the public about how we might do them. And that's been sort of played out in the UK with the Manchester enforcement issue just recently, is about whether how we might go about making these things happen. And the debates stopped being about this is the outcome we want to achieve, how can we make it happen, but it's come down to how much money can we have for different things, and it's quite complex. So I'm going to summarize the one here about difference, but simplification of the messages, I've put this down as, because I think the issue raised by the Assistant Chief Constable yesterday, and also we've heard it before from government ministers in the UK, is trying to make this very simple. You know, the rule of 6, hands, face, space, these sorts of statements. We need to have a very simple, straightforward message that people believe in, and then we need to be thinking about how do we support that message rather than it just being about that message. I love the comment around the power of the BTP chief, whose name I was forgotten. Was so powerful. It's good that his message was powerful rather than his personality, which is good. And then yeah, and Karen's point here. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here on this. It's please keep putting things in, and we will add to them before we send the presentation round. So if you have any other views, and just put them into the chat for now under these 3 areas. But afterwards, we're going to ask you to fill in some questions to give us some feedback around various bits. Please think about what you think we might add into the strategy, what we think might be useful for policing to be thinking about on these levels. The reason why, from my perspective, all of this is so important is that any analysis, this is from McKinsey, they're one of the big consultancy companies, and they've been looking about innovation and through a crisis, and how important it is to actually take this as an opportunity rather than just as the threat. And they talked to the top 200 CEOs of international companies, or a top 200 CEOs of international companies. These are really big companies. And you look at, most people thought that business was going to fundamentally change forever over the next 5 years because of this. And we know from any analysis of what's happened in major crises like war, famine, and illness, is that the step change is phenomenal. Things that normally take 10 to 15 years can happen in a few months. You know, and it's not just a question that it's going to change the way business, but also most of them think 85% it's going to change what customers want, what people want and need. And are we thinking as a police service, what do the public want? What do the public want in the future of their police service? Do they want a police service who are involved in these issues, or do they want something that's slightly different? Very few of them, 21%, thought they had the resources and commitment to grow successfully. So there's an opportunity here for business for growth, or in policing terms, this is probably a risk in terms of a need to change of activity. But in business, people don't think that they have the expertise and resources to do this. So we are going to be challenged. And 2/3 think this is the most challenging moment in their executive career. And I would imagine that many police chiefs are feeling very similarly. So those are the sort of data on the left. And the data on the right, which is the more positive way of looking at this, I suppose, is the fact that those companies who are most innovative are, not only do they do better during a crisis, that they can respond more quickly during a crisis, but do better in the long term after the crisis as well. So there's a real opportunity here for the police to actually use some of their own innovative thinking staff. And we all know that frontline cops are probably the most innovative people in the world, because that's what they do on a daily basis, is work hard to get around problems. And to try and release some of that internal innovation may well be what we need to do in order to find a way through all of this. From an internal perspective, I just sort of bring us back to this terror management theory. I think this is so important to our thinking about staff and society. You know, that if we are not producing a belief system, if we're not got the symbols of success, and we're not creating some form of stability and permanence in society and within policing organisations, then people lose this belief that by complying with things they will be safe, and start thinking about their own safety above other issues. And when we start seeing that, we will unpick an awful lot of what policing is about, which is about officers willing to get in the, go towards a problem rather than go away from a problem, and officers more consider what they think is the right answer rather than what the organisation's is. If we link this to sort of policing and criminology, I'll put a paper in attached to this, so you can download it later on, from Bottoms, Farrington, and I can't remember the other guy, looking at the impact of confidence in police and partners to dealing with crime. That the higher the levels of confidence, the less the likelihood of crime is, and how important it is from a societal point of view that people believe the police are able to deal with things. And if people don't think that's possible, then the mechanisms of enforcement become larger. So, I suppose, I think the key element here is to think about what are the opportunities that come from this. I think one of the opportunities would be to think about, actually use of digital technology, releasing our officers to use social media more freely, to actually start thinking about the issues of disproportionality through the lens of the impact of people, seeing it played out. I think the risks are, if we, just sort of talked a little bit about some of the risks, but I really believe there are massive risks here for policing. If we don't grasp some of these situations, the policing model that is used at the moment in the UK predominantly, but in many, many countries, which is very much about the relationship between the individual officer and the public, as well as the officers and the community, and as well as the police services, police forces and society, they will change, and we will become driven even further into a law enforcement role, where the only opportunity we have for our staff is for them to issue fixed penalty notices or to arrest people. And what I'd like you to reflect on as we come away from these two workshops is, what would you do? So we're going to ask you some questions, and I would really, really like to gather as much information as possible so that we can, when we come to our conference in December, put some of these thoughts together in a way that are accessible for other people. So just before I wrap up, has anybody got any particular questions or comments that they'd like us to address? Anything that we haven't come across? And Karen, is there anything in the chat that I've missed that we should reflect back on?
Resourcing comes up, and there's a few comments about how we can support the police by enhancing either paid reserves or the special constabulary. Obviously, an issue there is the volunteer nature of that, and whether people actually will be able to afford to do volunteering when they've got to try and earn a living.
Yeah, I think the whole issue of resources in both the short term, the impact of having to change resources around and to make things happen, but in the medium and long term are quite massive. And how we bring all that together. And I think you're 100% right around the volunteering. There are two ways volunteering can go. Either one, people will think, I really want to be part of making a difference and I want to volunteer to do something. Or the other one is they'll think this is too risky and too dangerous for us to and why would we want to do this, because it's not really fit in with society views. And to be honest, in my view, unless we can get some sort of better position about our relationship with some of our diverse communities, volunteering is not going to grow as wide as it should do. And I think David raised an issue here about police education. There are massive opportunities for us around police education. The fact that we've been able to have a discussion over the last few weeks with people from Switzerland, Sweden, Peru, Cambodia, China, the UK, including Scotland, England, Wales, the very different operating contexts, to get some idea of what's going on, but also the ability to actually, once we develop from this, because we will use this to produce some products that people might want to use, we can actually come up with some better approaches to training using technology, reducing the need for people to travel, reducing the need for people to actually change their work routine to do a short, intense little piece of work, is a real opportunity for the future. But also the need for education, police education, to be thinking about all of the different aspects that we've talked about. That was really, really useful for me, and I enjoyed that. So that was very helpful. What I didn't enjoy was hearing this, this sort of getting this feedback from such a horrible impact on officers in Peru, and the impact, really getting some sort of feeling for how difficult this is for police leaders. I'd like to really thank our international colleagues who have given such richness to the debate over the last 2 days. I hope, no, not I hope, the whole intention of today was to try and have a look at how some of the issues raised by Roger on crisis management, by Polly on the issues of harmful practices, and Graham and Mike this week on cybercrime, together with the sort of organisational issues of how we respond to these incidents and the education issues, bringing all of that together will give us quite a strong picture of what's happened in 2020 and the impact that it will have on police-public relationships. And I hope that moving forward to next week, to the workshops, to give much greater focus on the international concepts, to hear from colleagues in detail about what's happening in these countries, will be really, really useful. So I'd like to thank you all for your involvement, and again, make it very clear that we would really like you to fill in the questionnaire is the wrong way of putting it, but we're going to send out to you this set of questions that we'd like you to get some data from. So if you could get that back to us as soon as possible, we'll make sure we use that. So thank you, Daisy, for filling in the form. So what we want to know a little bit, what have you found useful from this workshop and why? And that's really just a feedback bit for us to help us take things forward so that we can design things a bit better in the future. Then we wanted to actually get a bit of data collection. So what impacts have you seen in your country? So thinking about the sorts of things we've discussed over the last 2 days, what's the impacts been for you locally? And sort of taking that a little bit stage further, is there anything you'd like to see change or any good practice you would like to share? Things that you feel quite strongly about, or not necessarily strongly about, but things you think would be useful for the rest of the world to hear about? And what other aspects of trust and confidence would you like to see discussed at the conference? So I want to make sure that we get all this together so that we can actually present something which really picks up the richness of the debate we've had over the last 2 days, and we can take it forward. So thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all soon.
Rod,
Thanks,
just
Rod. Thanks, Rod.